Welcome, everybody. On today's episode of the Transform Your Birth podcast, I thought I would explore a particularly big issue in childbirth, and that's the pain, to demystify the pain. It seems to be the biggest issue most women feel like they have to overcome in their minds to feel excited and ready to have their babies. And it's interesting, when you look at our culture and the way we talk about childbirth, so much of it is related to the pain. The biggest piece of advice women often get when they're pregnant, they're out in public and some random person will come up to them and see their bumps and say, "Oh, you're having a baby. I've got one bit of advice for you. Have the drugs, have the epidural." And so the whole idea around, sorry, I'll just pause this. Hi, welcome again to the Transform Your Birth podcast. This week I thought I'd do something a little bit different and tackle one of the biggest issues in childbirth, and that is the idea of going through the pain. Now, many women, when they're pregnant, get told other people's stories, which out of context and without really understanding the full nature of that experience can seem very overwhelming and very fear-producing. And the other thing is the advice women get. They're out there with their gorgeous bumps and random people from all walks of life will say, "Oh, you're having a baby. I've got one bit of advice for you. Have the drugs, have the epidural." And that's a very disempowering message, because the message under the message is you can't do it. You're not going to be able to do it. And I don't know about you, but if you contemplate for a moment all of the women that have given birth for you to exist today, that's a lot of women. And long before the drugs were ever created, women have been able to get through childbirth. We have since the beginning of time. And so to be told things like you're going to need the drugs from the very beginning sets women off on a path of disempowerment, of not actually believing that they can get through without the drugs. Now, there is a role for drugs, and I think we're fortunate to have them under certain circumstances. But that messaging is a very disempowering message. And so one of the things you need to realise, and a lot of people don't realise this, is that all women experience the pain differently. And every time you have a baby, it's a different experience. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on the different possibilities when it comes to how you experience the pain and what actually creates it. Now, there are some women who will describe the pain of childbirth as excruciating, the worst pain you'll ever experience. And that's very real for those women. And we need to love those women and really care for them, because they've travelled a very tough road to get their babies here. But then you'll get some women who'll say, "Yeah, look, it was painful, but I got a baby at the end and it was all worth it." And so those women have been able to, on some level, accept the intensity of the pain and look at what they got as a result and are okay to move forward. Whereas the women who've experienced it as excruciating have potentially really struggled and not been supported in the best way that they could be. And then you'll get some women describe it as, "Oh, I found it really manageable. I thought it would be worse than what it was." Okay. I think when I was growing up, I had women in my family describe it like that. It's just something that you do, you get on with it, don't make a fuss. So that's kind of how they described it to me. And then other women don't experience it as pain at all. They'll use language like, "I wouldn't describe it as pain. It was more like intense pressure or tightenings, but I wouldn't call it pain." And then women can even experience states of ecstasy and bliss and even orgasm. Okay. Now, that can be a shock to some people. I think we all should know that orgasmic birth exists, because there's something going on with a woman who has an orgasm that isn't going on with a woman who's experiencing it as excruciating. And that's not to say one is better than the other or one is right and the other's wrong. It's not what this is about at all. It's about understanding that there is a pain continuum, and that if we can move women down to the more manageable side of the pain continuum, typically what that means is that they're activating the body's natural resources, because the hormone that feeds orgasm is the same hormone that makes those contractions happen. That's oxytocin. So what does that tell you? Mother Nature doesn't want us to experience childbirth as excruciating, because then we'll never go back for more. She wants us to perpetuate the survival of the species. And so we're not making use of that, because culturally we're up in the perception that childbirth is something that's painful, that you're going to need drugs for, and it's something to be feared. But when we can activate that hormonal blueprint, which I call performance-enhancing hormones, then we can really experience childbirth in a way that not only helps us to get through it and over it, but also to feel ready for that next big phase, which is being a parent to a very needy newborn. And so my goal for people when I teach them is to really move them back towards that middle part of the continuum, where it becomes a little bit more manageable when you know and understand what your body needs and what you can do to work with birth, not against it. Now, before I go any further with this, I want to make something very, very clear. Women who experience excruciating birth can do so for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with those women. Often it can be things like lack of support, a partner who doesn't know how to bring comfort to her, or midwives or caregivers who are in and out and too busy to help her to find comfort. It can be lack of care for the emotional state of the mother if she's particularly scared and fearful. It can be through things like induction, where the synthetic oxytocin can be very hard and heavy on her body. And it can also be around complexity of the actual birth experience. So maybe the baby's in not such a good position, and that complexity is causing it to be more painful. But here's the thing about complexity. You can have complex birth and still find it manageable, but there's all sorts of things that will contribute to the way a woman experiences the pain of labor. Now, it's helpful to understand that pain continuum, because I think what happens is people think, because I experience birth a certain way, that's how you're going to experience birth. And if you don't, you're either lying or you've forgotten, okay? So it's important that we understand that there are possibilities when it comes to managing the pain. Now, in order to really understand this, it's important that you realize that the things that the elements around how a woman experiences those sensations in labor are not just about that woman. There's somebody else who plays a really big role in how that woman experiences the sensations of labor, and that's the baby. Now, some babies, when they're going through the birth process, they're pushing on the door, and it's the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix which releases those pulses of oxytocin, and that's how going to govern how intense those contractions are. So if a baby's really pushing at the door and wanting to get out of there, like my first son was, he was very, very solidly on that cervix, then you can get very big, intense sensations. But typically you'll have a shorter labor because that baby's really working to open that door. And then some babies don't feel the need to do that much. They just lie there and let your body do all the work, and they're not putting much pressure on. The position of the baby will influence the way you experience those sensations. When a baby's in an optimal position, where their spine is at the front of the belly and their little crowns of their head is really sort of pushing on that cervix, then that's going to feel very, very different than if the baby's rotated and their spine is on your spine, and that's going to cause your sensations to feel very different. There's other things that will influence the way a woman experiences those sensations. Dehydration. If you're really dehydrated, your labor is going to feel much more painful. Fatigue is another one. If you're really tired and fatigued, it's going to feel more painful. That's why I always recommend to my families, particularly for the birthing mums, to actually take that, as much nesting time as they can, because nesting is a very important stage of your pregnancy, helping you to build up your energy reserves. So you don't want to be going into labor feeling really, really tired. And then there's just the mystery. It'll be what it'll be. Pain is a very subjective experience as well in the mind. If you've had any previous experiences with not managing pain, that can play out in your labour as well. So there's a lot of things that can influence the way a woman experiences those sensations that are about the woman, things that you can potentially influence, but things that you just can't. And so this is what birth invites us to do, is to step into that mystery, knowing that we don't know how those sensations are going to be, and we don't know how long the birth's going to be, but there's a part of us that has to push through because we can't get off the bus. Okay. Now, I want to go to the origins of the pain so you actually understand what it is that actually creates it. In order to do that, you need to understand two very powerful physiological responses. One is called the stress response. Now, the stress response is what we activate if we get chased by a tiger. Okay, so any type of predator or any threat to our survival will elicit the stress response. So what happens in the body when we go into stress? Well, you get a big surge of fear, which releases a big surge of adrenaline. And your muscles get very tense, your senses go on full alert, and there's a rediversion of blood flow. Now, this is a very important point. Most of your blood is in your core, but when you go into stress, your blood, 300 to 400% more blood goes into your arms and legs. And it's pretty obvious why that's happening, isn't it? Because in a state of protection, if your life is at risk, you need that blood and oxygen into your arms and legs to either take on the predator, run away, or do what you need to do to survive. And so that's a very different physiological response. And it's stimulated by fear, which is why having a culture of fear around childbirth isn't very useful, because to go into a stress response when you're in labour is going to change your labour, and not for the better. Okay, we're not meant to drop our babies in front of tigers. It goes into a protective response. Now, the flip side of the stress response is what's called the deep relaxation response. Okay, this was a term that was coined by Herbert Benson, who studied the deep relaxation response in opposition to the stress response by studying people who meditate. Now, when we go into deep states of relaxation, we can access all parts of our brain. Our blood flow stays where it needs to be. And when you're in labour, that's with the uterus, we need the blood flow in the uterus because you've got a big, powerful uterus doing a big, powerful job. You can release things like endorphins, which are the body's natural opiates, pain-relieving substances. And you can activate that primary hormonal cocktail that's going to help you to work with the birth, not against it. So the stress response is not useful for childbirth. What we do need is the deep relaxation response. When you're deeply relaxed, your body can activate and bring into play those performance-enhancing, feel-good hormones, as well as keeping the blood and oxygen supply to the uterus. Now, the uterus, let's talk about it. It's a muscle, okay? And in its pre-pregnant state, it's quite small, but as it gets bigger, it can stretch to meet the needs of the baby as it grows. Now, being a muscle, it needs lots of blood and oxygen. It's got fibers at the front on the outer layer, which are what is trying to open the door. And so when a woman goes into labour with the support of oxytocin through the baby pushing on the doorway, the muscle then contracts, and that sensation is trying to pull open the doorway. Not only is it contracting, but it's retracting, which is pushing the baby out. Now, that's the biggest job a muscle will ever do. It's the biggest job that any muscle will ever do. In fact, even though men are stronger than women, the strongest muscle in the human body is actually in the woman's body, and it's the uterus. They call it the strongest muscle in the human body because its job is to push out a baby. That's why contractions are intense, because it's quite a big thing. And when it's the first time your body's ever opened the door to your cervix like that, which starts quite long and thin, then it can take a lot of contractions to really start to wake the cervix up, that it can stretch to pull it back over the baby's head and at the same time be pushing your baby out. So in order for all of that to happen, one of the beautiful things about labour is we don't need to think to make our uterus work. It's all wired into the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that makes everything happen automatically. You don't have to think to pump your heart. You don't have to think to digest. Mums, you don't have to think to give birth. That, to me, is great news. You don't have to make anything happen. You just need to allow it to happen. And in order to allow it to happen, you just need to be relaxed and accept the sensations for what they are. So the other part of that uterus, that particularly the cervical opening, we want that part of the uterus to be soft and flaccid, because if there's tension in the doorway to the uterus, it's going to be very hard to open that door. So once again, the mother needs to be relaxed in order to keep that doorway nice and flaccid and flexible and able to be pulled open by those big contractions. And then you have the blood and oxygen supply to the muscle, and being a big, powerful muscle, doing a big, powerful job, it needs lots of blood and oxygen. When a muscle doesn't get enough blood and oxygen, it becomes ischemic. Okay, ischemia is another word for cramping. If you've ever cramped in your legs or calves, you know that's painful. And what you're trying to do when you cramp up is you try and stretch it and massage it, because you're trying to get the blood back into that muscle. So when a muscle doesn't get enough blood and oxygen, it gets very painful. So all of this is connected to the autonomic nervous system to make everything happen automatically. You don't have to think to give birth, you just need to allow it to happen. But what also happens, what also is connected to that autonomic nervous system, is what's called the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response. The parasympathetic response is what makes labour happen, okay? It's what opens the door and pushes the baby out. But if a woman goes into the sympathetic response, that can get in the way of labour. And that's connected to fight flight. So and a couple of things happen when we go into fight flight. So let me help you connect the dots. If a woman in labour experiences fear, triggering fight flight, the blood and oxygen supply will move away from the uterus into her arms and legs, and there'll be tension in the doorway. And that tension is designed to keep the baby in. But it also makes labour more painful. Now, adrenaline will come in with the fear response, and that'll also cut out oxytocin, which can even stop the labour, because Mother Nature doesn't want you having a baby in front of a tiger, okay? So as part of that, we don't want to elicit fight flight, but of course we don't have tigers in the labour room, but we do have tigers in our head. And so when people tell you their stories and those stories stick in your subconscious, creating fear, that can find its way into your labour room. So we've got to work with our fears. We've got to unlock our subconscious blocks in order to be able to learn to relax and work with the birth, not against it. And when we relax and work with the birth, not against it, we make full use of that oxytocin, because it's a feel-good hormone and it fuels your labour, making labour very efficient. We have beautiful endorphins and prolactin, which is a very relaxing bonding hormone, relaxin. All of these beautiful hormones get activated, making labour more manageable. So I find that when I help people to understand the difference between the stress response and the relaxation response, you can see why birth can be very, very painful for some women, particularly if they're not supported emotionally and supported to find comfort. And some women just aren't. So we need to change that. So I hope that's been really, really helpful. Now, in order to work with the intensity of those sensations, whatever they are for the birthing mum, we have resources. And I want to talk just briefly about these resources now, because everybody should know that they've got resources. The first thing is endorphins. You know, people are very quick to tell you you're going to need the drugs, but what they should realize, actually, you've already got them, and they're endorphins. And when we're relaxed, we can make full use of them. Endorphins are very powerful opiates, and they travel quicker to the brain than pain does. So they have this capacity to supersede pain. And of course, your endorphin levels in your pregnancy are increasing because not only do they come with relaxation, they come with sustained effort. And that's what a pregnancy is. Not only are you living, you're growing a baby. And as part of that growing of the baby, your endorphin levels are increasing through your pregnancy. And then during the birth, they can peak. And they're beautiful, beautiful things that we need in labour. The other resource you have, it's a very powerful resource, and that is your mind. Now, the mind, when it's harnessed and directed to what we want it to be directed to, is one of your best tools in the toolkit. Now, one of the things we have to appreciate about our mindset when it comes to birth is that when it comes to childbirth, we just typically think of it as painful. If I was to go out and interview, say, 100 people on the street and say, I'm going to play a word association exercise with you. I'm going to say a word and I want you to tell me the first thing you think of. If I was to say the word childbirth, what do you think they'd say? You've probably guessed it, the pain, wouldn't they? We've got in our minds childbirth equals pain. Now, let me ask you, the listener, what childbirth is about. It's about having a baby. So we should have childbirth equals baby. But no, we're just childbirth equals pain, childbirth equals pain, childbirth equals pain. Childbirth can be painful. I'm not denying that, but it can be a lot of things, and I've already explained. It can even be orgasmic. So what you focus on, you fuel. Okay, so if you're walking around just assuming childbirth is painful, chances are it's going to be, because you're telling your mind exactly how this experience is. But if you take those blinkers off and you open your mind to possibilities, you open your mind to seeing the benefit and the power of the pain, that every contraction is bringing you one step closer to meeting your baby, that every contraction is helping you to understand that you are far more powerful than you ever imagined. And as I've said before, you don't find that out by sitting on a lounge watching Netflix. You have to be pushed to your limits. That's the power of the birth process. It's helping you wake up to recognizing that you can sustain and cope with so much more than what you think. And your baby needs you to believe that. When you're getting up for the third or fourth time at night, your baby needs you to have a belief and a reference point that, yeah, I can do this. I can keep stepping up and stepping up and stepping up. That's parenting in a nutshell. Yeah, that's all you're doing is stepping up each time to the challenges and the joys of having a baby and children. So changing the way you think about those sensations, it's really powerful. And language is a very powerful definer of experience. So I encourage my families to ditch the word pain. And the reason is this: pain is a word to describe something going wrong in the body. But when you're in labour, it's the opposite. It means everything's progressing. Okay, it's a good sign that you're getting these contractions. And so rather than call it pain, even if it's painful, try other words like intense pressure, tightenings, waves, surges, rushes. I personally like the word sensations, the sensations of labour, because it's non-specific. There's no value judgment attached to it. It just is what it is, and you're up for this. So change your language, change your thoughts, change your experience. Other things you can do with your mind is take it somewhere other than what you're currently experiencing. For example, going to a happy place in nature that you've gone to, or thinking about other things. Some women count when they're in labour. Some women focus on words or images or mantras that they've come up with that really speaks to them and really is telling their mind how they want to be in this experience. Some women focus on music, all sorts of ways of managing the sensations of labour. So change your thinking, change your focus, you'll change your experience. And then, of course, there are other resources which are tools for comfort, things like movement, changing positions. They seem benign, but when you've got a lot of pressure and tension around your hip area and you're pushing against that, that's counter pressure, and that brings comfort. Women should not be stuck on beds in labour unless there's a damn good reason for it to be. So any type of monitoring that you might need to do, make sure you can move. Ask for the Bluetooth or the scalp monitor, because those monitors help you to move and respond physiologically and organically to your labour in order to find comfort. Other tools: the shower, hot packs, massage, acupressure, cold washes, all sorts of having beautiful smells in the room, music. All of these things help women to work with their birth and to find comfort and support, and it protects their emotional state. So that's so very important. So with that said, I think we'll just finish off now with a very, very clear message that women have always been able to give birth, and we are far more resilient and powerful than we could ever even imagine. And childbirth is one of those opportunities in life for you to discover that. So it's important that we let go of the fear of the pain and to start to see the benefit of it. Because when you can appreciate Mother Nature's blueprint, how to activate it, activate that potential, that latent potential inside of you, and see just how beautifully it's setting you up for that next phase, then you start to realize that there's no need to fear it. In fact, welcome it. Love those sensations, because they're bringing you closer to meeting your baby. So I hope that's been really helpful to demystify the pain. So just reviewing that, we want to move out of stress and into deep relaxation. When we're in deep relaxation, we keep the blood flow where it needs to be, which is with the uterus, which makes labour more manageable. Work with your endorphins, activate those endorphins. Learn to focus and harness your mind in a powerful way. Work on your fears, anything that could get in the way of you really being able to surrender to birth. Learn the tools for comfort and believe that you can do this. Okay, so I hope you found this really, really useful, and we'll see you again next week with another story. Thank you. Bye.